nap.
We couldn't do that in the United States until COVID either, but
well,
in this case, actually, there was no problem because I was obviously just able to sit here working, and thankfully, I actually don't have something at the other end, at least until 11 o'clock. So I've got an hour with you, if that's enough.
well, that's extremely generous of you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. Are we pretty much
ready to go?
Right, okay. In that case, General, what I'll do is I'll formally start the session in a moment, then I'll ask you to introduce yourself, which is just name, and then if you can imagine the newspaper, there's normally a comma, and then however you wish to be described for this session, if you see what I mean. Pick your...
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Ready?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, broadcast.
Order, order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're very lucky to have with us General Petraeus. General, could you briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Tom, and it's a pleasure to be with you all, having done this on some occasions in the past, about Iraq, in fact. I'm a retired U.S. Army 4-star general. I was privileged to command U.S. Central Command, which is the entire Middle East, including Afghanistan, then to be the commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan and also U.S. forces there, then the director of the CIA, and now for the last 8.5 years, I've been the chairman of the KKR Global Institute and a partner in the global investment firm KKR, as well as having various academic posts during that time as well.
Thank you very much, sir. If I may go straight in. When President Biden announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan in April, you warned that the US might come to regret it. Why did you say that?
Well, frankly, I feared that what did happen would actually happen. And with respect to, again, this particular decision, I feared that we would see at some point, and increasingly as I saw that the 18,000 contractors were withdrawn who were so essential to maintaining the most critical element of the Afghan security forces, their Air Force, I publicly said that I feared a psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces. And of course, that is what did transpire. And the result, I think it's very hard to say that this result is anything but heartbreaking, tragic, and in many respects disastrous. I don't know how you can see the Taliban replacing a government, however imperfect, however frustrating, however maddening, however corrupt, however much there was political nepotism, you name it, but seeing it replaced by a regime, an ultra-conservative Islamist government that seems intent on taking the country back to a 7th century interpretation of Islam, similar to what it imposed on the country when it previously ruled it, when the Al-Qaeda was allowed to have a sanctuary on Afghan soil. And of course, the human catastrophe that is looming in Afghanistan is going to be one that will require the world to take action. The fact is that the Taliban has no money. The 75% of the budget that the US and other donor nations used to provide is undoubtedly not going to be forthcoming, certainly not to the Taliban. There will be efforts to provide humanitarian assistance that are already ongoing in substantial amounts, but not directly to the Taliban. Its reserves are frozen around the world, and the IMF and World Bank drawing rights and so forth are also on hold. So the prospect for the Afghan people is one that is very, very bleak indeed. And in fact, I think the best representation of the Afghan citizens' regard for the new government is that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, have left the country and are trying to leave the country. I get multiple emails every day from individuals who served as our battlefield interpreters and qualify for the special immigrant visa who we've left behind, and their family members. There are tens of thousands of them alone, and we have a moral obligation to them. In addition, There are many tens of thousands of others whose safety has been put in jeopardy and who presumably would qualify for different categories of visa, but are required to get outside the country to apply for that. So again, I think the prospects for Afghanistan are very, very grim. You see already signs of the Islamic State carrying out horrific attacks, principally against Shia. You see resistance forces gathering a degree of momentum and fighting the Taliban. And you see very significant internal disputes between the Afghan Taliban, led by Mullah Baradar, who, as you know, has withdrawn from Kabul to Kandahar, and the Haqqani network, part of the Taliban, which is ensconced in Kabul. So I can't say that I laid all of this out with enormous clarity, but I did actually months prior to that collapse say publicly that I feared a psychological collapse and feared the kind of outcome that we have seen. The extraordinary logistical accomplishments of the airlift notwithstanding, which did indeed pull out 123,000 or so troops, the bulk of those on US airlift, but certainly was not a process that one would say was characterized by meticulous organization and coordination. Rather, it was obviously quite chaotic and also resulted in the tragic loss of 13 of our men and women in uniform and nearly 200 innocent Afghan civilians.
So, look, given your points there, sorry, I should say for the record that I did once serve under your command, so I probably shouldn't be calling you Sir anymore. But but when
one of the great privileges of my lifetime.
They speak of little else. You've set out very clearly many of your warnings that you gave before July and indeed before August of this year.
And last year.
And indeed in last
really
year.
For a number of years.
Exactly.
Because if I could, my argument has been that we should have the strategic patience to maintain a sustainable commitment. And sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. We had not had a single American lost in combat in the year and a half prior to the airlift. The cost was quite reduced. We had 2 or 3 times the number of coalition troops on the ground that there were US, and largely what the US was doing, no longer on the front lines, but was providing advice, assist, and enabling. And the enablers, the most critical element, the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms, drones, in particular the Reapers, and then obviously US close air support when it was necessary to augment what it was that we provided for the Afghan Air Force.
May I ask, given all the warnings that you gave, and I know you weren't alone in doing so, but given all the warnings that you gave, why do you think President Biden and his national security team took the decision that they did? They can't have been unwarned, and indeed we saw from cables that were, diptails that were published only today in the Times, that the UK government was getting very much the same warnings from our embassy there, and I assume that the US embassy was probably giving roughly the same advice as well. So why do you think the White House made this decision?
Well, I think that, again, there have been explanations that have been reasonably clear, making what would be, I think, the best argument for why we undertook what it was we did. And I would just leave it to, again, those explanations provided by the Commander-in-Chief and by the National Security Team members. And of course, I was by no means alone. Again, the Dunford Commission, this was a congressionally chartered bipartisan commission that was co-chaired by a former Republican senator, as I recall, and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a former commander in Afghanistan. General Joe Dunford basically advised the same that I offered. Then there were a number of other studies and analyses from Brookings and so forth that, again, offered similar. Now, to be sure, none of us ever could say how long it would take. I publicly said again that we should acknowledge that we cannot win in Afghanistan because, of course, our Pakistani partners were never willing to eliminate the sanctuaries allowed in Baluchistan for the Afghan Taliban headquarters outside Quetta, and then in North Waziristan in particular for the headquarters that was maintained by the Haqqani network. So the enemy headquarters and some of their, if you will, their infrastructure were these were outside of Afghanistan, beyond our reach by and large. We occasionally had some authority to do something, as is publicly known, but by and large did not. And essentially it meant that in this very vast country with the access from outside, that you really could never go to the complete source, and you just had to understand you weren't going to be able to win. This was not a situation like Iraq where you could drive violence down by 85% during the course of the surge. And I told that to Congress actually over the years when I was both in the hearing for to be the commander in Afghanistan, and then subsequently to that as the commander and then as the director of the CIA. But again, it's sometimes okay to manage a situation. We are indeed, to be fair to this administration, they are doing the right thing literally all the way around the rest of the world when it comes to Islamist extremists, together with our partners, the UK typically foremost among them. If you look at what we are still doing in Iraq, in Syria, in the Horn of Africa, in Northwest Africa, in Western Africa, Southeast, you name it, around the world, we have learned that you have to keep not just an eye on Islamist extremists, you have to keep pressure on them so that even if you can't actually have the kind of comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign you might like to employ to get to the root causes of extremism, at the very least, you can periodically disrupt and degrade the capabilities of the Islamic State so that they cannot carry out the kind of attacks that terrorized countries in Western Europe, indeed at the height of the Islamic State Caliphate, when they owned that ground in northeast Syria and northern Iraq.
Now, General, just briefly before, I'm going to come to Alicia Cairns in a second, just for a quick intervention. But before I do, may I just ask, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has said that the evacuation of Kabul was a logistical success but a strategic failure. It does somewhat stretch my understanding of logistical success that Bagram Air Base was closed before the withdrawal. How do you assess the UK and the international community's evacuation operations? Some countries, like France, evacuated their people very early. Others, like the UK and the United States, rather later. How do you read the situation?
Well, I think you really have to go to in a sense, the big ideas, the assessments of what would take place in particular, and ask if there were not some misjudgments in those categories. I mean, clearly the idea, at least with hindsight, although again, I should note that there were some of us who did actually say that we feared this psychological collapse of the Afghan forces, which did transpire. But the idea that you would withdraw your soldiers before you withdraw the diplomats, the American citizens, the green card holders, the special immigrant visa holders and their family members and others whose lives were in jeopardy because of their service with us. I might note with a slight degree of quiet pride that the CIA did carry out quite an impressive quiet evacuation, assembling people at a base that was very near Kabul and then taking them in through a special gate that was open just for that purpose, or flying them in helicopters. But by and large, I think the description that is merited is that of, I mean, it was a logistical marvel in some respects. I mean, the fact that you could just pull this many people out in such a short period of time, I think is an extraordinary comment on our sheer logistical capacity, and also just to impose order on what was clearly a chaotic situation outside the gates after that early initial incident. Of course, that image of individuals hanging on to a C-17, but I prefer the image, or also would add the image of the C-17, the entire well of which was filled with civilians on the order of so many hundreds, that beyond what the capacity was for the seats, that they took the seats out and just lined them up. And the pilot said, "Just watch me, we'll get this thing off the ground." And he did. And he knew the capacity of a C-17, as you do as well, having ridden in them. But the idea that, again, you know, how to assess it as a strategic again, I forget his word, setback or failure or what have you. Again, the question is, what, in a sense, were we thinking to have all the military out? And clearly it was based on an assumption that the Afghans were going to continue to prevail, certainly well beyond Kabul, for quite an extended period of time. And obviously that was a serious miscalculation. The fact that the Afghans could not, without the 18,000 contractors, maintain these very sophisticated US provided helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters and Little Bird attack helicopters and C-130s and close air support aircraft that were crucial to the Afghan security force. And I might explain, just for your members and perhaps for those who might watch this, there has been much said about, well, we should have made the Afghan forces more like the Taliban, lighter, more easily. Look, they are counterinsurgents, not insurgents. The Taliban right now are finding out how much more difficult it is to be a counterinsurgent, because you actually have to defend stuff. And you just can't sort of attack at will and then go back to the mountains and hang out with your fellow fighters until you do your next foray forward. You have to defend population centers, critical infrastructure, and the construct of the Afghan security forces. And one can question whether we should have insisted on providing US aircraft or continued what was being provided when I was the commander, which was more Soviet Russian style, which was much more analog, and which the Afghans could maintain. That is a separate issue and another debate. But the fact is that what you had to have was a construct of about 100,000 soldiers, keeping in mind the Army, the military is only about 150,000. Another 150,000 were police and others, but they're not as useful in this type of fighting, as you well know. So you have them defending these population centers and critical infrastructure. And then when they are hit by the Taliban in this vast country with limited road infrastructure and limited road security at times, you have to airlift with helicopters or C-130s, special operations forces. And as you know, there was 30 to 40,000 of these, and they were really quite capable, the commandos in particular. And they would respond, they would reinforce those that are on the front lines and fight back. And this did happen early on in fighting, first in the north and then in Kandahar. There was quite a good example of how that should work. And the Afghan Air Force would provide the first line of close air support with its fixed wing and then its rotary wing aircraft, with the US then providing, especially with drones, to enable very accurate precision close air support to augment what was provided by the Afghans. But there's really no alternative to that. And those that say, well, we just should have been like insurgents, overlook a pretty basic fact, and that is that we were not insurgents. The Afghans weren't insurgents, they were counterinsurgents, and they had to secure key areas against insurgents and extremists. And there was really no alternative in that regard. Again, you can argue about what we did insist on providing over time, and that is certainly debatable. But the construct of this, I do not think was debatable, nor is the idea that, well, it all went wrong when we started doing nation building. Look, if you don't do nation building, to whom do you hand off security and institutional tasks that you are performing for the country whose government you have toppled? Noting, of course, that yes, we did not even get the inputs right, as you have heard me describe before, until late 2010. And by inputs, I mean roughly the right level of resources, military, diplomatic, intelligence, rule of law, all the other capabilities that we need, the right leaders, the right preparation of our forces, the right organizational architecture, the right strategy above all these. And certainly even within that, there were mistakes made, some things were overdone, undoubtedly threw money at problems at various times where we might have exercised a bit more restraint. But part of that was because we were always racing against the clock. And we knew that from the time that we had the inputs right, which yes, did coincide with my time as the commander, but purely because of timing, it was largely set up by General McChrystal's report and his early work. But we knew that within 6 months, we were going to start to have to draw down, regardless of the conditions on the ground. So again, these were some of the issues. There's no question about us taking our eye off the ball early on, focusing on Iraq. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, used to say that in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. And that's what delayed ever getting the inputs right. And we lost the time between 2001 and 2010 because of that in many respects. We were always sort of shooting behind the target, but finally when we got ahead, but then did not at the end of the day have the strategic patience for a sustainable commitment.
Can I go to Alicia Cairns, who wanted to pick up on one of the elements you raised?
Certainly.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, General. It's a privilege to have you today. I just wanted to draw you back briefly to your comments on Quetta. And obviously, you rightly stated the Taliban who'd sat waiting there, others might say harboured within Pakistan. It seems to be an inconvenient truth that the international community is ignoring, that the Taliban have lived quite happily in Quetta waiting to be able to get across back into Afghanistan. What do you think our posture should be with Afghanistan going forward, and what responsibility do you lay on the Pakistanis in terms of the success of Taliban and their preparedness to be able to go back into Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, with respect, and again, the privilege is mine, but with respect, I don't think we ignored by any means the fact that the Taliban, I mean, we roughly knew where they were. I mean, the best example
apologies.
of that is,
just to clarify, I mean the international community is now ignoring that inconvenient truth because we have to work with Pakistan as we go forward with Afghanistan rather than retrospectively during the time.
Even with respect to that, I don't think we're ignoring that either. I think we've been quite forthright in noting that the Taliban, look, I used to go to the head of ISI as the director of the CIA or the chief of army staff as the head of Central Command or the commander of ISAF and say, you know, there's a reason why the Taliban headquarters is called the Quetta Shura. It's because they're located outside Quetta, the capital of Baluchistan, a province in which your army does nothing other than maintain the staff college and border crossings, as you have acknowledged to me. And so we get that. And the best example that we knew where they were is the publicly known and disclosed strike that actually killed the leader of the Taliban after Mullah Omar. So again, we had pretty good sense of what was going on. I don't necessarily agree with the assertions that the ISI was, you know, funding, directing, enabling. It was a much more complicated relationship between the inter-services intelligence, if you will, the CIA of the Pakistanis and the army of Pakistan. But certainly there was toleration and there was both a lack of capability and willingness to eliminate these sanctuaries from their soil. The Haqqani network was under a bit more attack over the years, as you will recall, in North Waziristan because of various arrangements that existed. And the head of that at various times, there were strikes to take out, but never the kind of real pressure. And you will remember in 2009, when I was privileged to be the Central Command commander, and we were actively supporting the Pakistanis fighting against the Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistani, the Pakistani Taliban, and the Pakistani army carried out a masterful offensive and then counterinsurgency campaign to eliminate the Taliban, the Tehrik-i Taliban Pakistani from Swat, Baijur, Moman, Khyber, Orakzai, and South Waziristan, but then lost momentum, will, and capability to close North Waziristan, which in many respects was always the heart of darkness. It's also where the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan is, Al-Qaeda elements, and a number of other extremists. Again, it's just a reality. And my sense of the situation was that in general, the Pakistanis questioned their own ability to deal with these forces, which had very considerable capability, without getting seriously bogged down by them. They didn't have the air mobility that we have. They would get through the mountain passes. Their lines of communication would be cut off. Again, you have to understand the terrain in these areas. This is a place where the mountain pass is at 12, 13, 14,000 feet, and very, very forbidding territory. And, you know, that was the reality with which we had to deal. We did certainly discuss this and confront and so forth, and we did not get anywhere. And that's still where we are. And for again, to hear some of the rhetoric that does come out of Islamabad, you know, one can certainly raise one's eyebrows, and I do, and have done that publicly. And indeed, when I met with the DGISI, the former DGISI now, actually just a couple of months ago when he was in Washington. Again, it is just a reality. And we did everything, you know, we had Ambassador Holbrooke dealing with him, the bulldozer. We had the highest levels dealing with them, and you could not make progress. And yet, of course, we depended on Pakistan for the lines of communication that go through the Khyber Pass and also down in the south into Kandahar province, which is a huge Achilles heel. And we discovered that when it was shut down for some 40 days, a month or two into my time as the director of the CIA.
General, forgive me, we're going to try and get through a few more questions, if I may.
Sure.
Stuart MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, General, for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you with us. In an article in the New Yorker, quotes you as saying, "We know the UK wanted to stay. You saw people in the UK Parliament say, we can't do anything independently. The answer, unfortunately, is probably not." And I wondered if you could speak to that a bit more and really get into, in your experience, how much influence does the UK have on strategic US policy in the context of the withdrawal?
Well, I think it's important here to remember a pretty stark reality, and that is that the United States doesn't just spend more than all of its 29 NATO allies put together, noting that one of those is North American, of course. It spends more than twice as much. In fact, it's 2-point-something times as much as every other NATO member put together. And therefore, even the largest of the NATO countries, UK, France, Germany, Italy, still are spending just a very modest subset of what the United States is devoting to our national defense. And the capability gap that has been created over the years, and one that I have watched from being a second lieutenant in Cold War Europe and the British Army of the Rhine and Northern Army Group and all of that, and then over the years as the executive officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the operations in Bosnia and Kosovo and so forth. And then, of course, as a commander myself during the invasion of Iraq, the subsequent 3-star tour, the 4-star tour. I always had a British deputy, I might add, which does give you some sense of the influence. I mean, there was one country in which I would stop every single time that I was going back and forth to the US, which thanks to the US Congress was fairly frequently. And that was the UK in London, and would go to number 10 and would go to Whitehall and all the other spots, the MOD and so forth. But at the end of the day, the reality is that in most of these kinds of endeavors, the US has to lead. And in truth, if it does not lead, it probably is not possible for the other coalition partners to stay or to be engaged. And that is, I think, that was reflected by the reality in Afghanistan. And I think it's somewhat inescapable. And now that does not mean that I am not a massive supporter of NATO. I mean, there's a reason why I was in Warsaw 3 weeks ago for the Warsaw Security Forum and in Rome last week. Again, and why I'll be in London, by the way, next week. Again, I am a huge transatlanticist. I am an enormous supporter of NATO. I was privileged to serve as a NATO 1-star, 3-star, 4-star, in each case dual-hatted to be sure. But at the end of the day, the reality is what it is. And that is a fact that without the US being the foundation for particularly for an expeditionary deployment, because of the sheer capacity. Again, we talked about the logistical capability that was demonstrated by the evacuation. Again, there's just no other country in the world that can do what the United States did in that evacuation. In fact, there's none that can even do a fraction of what was done by the United States, even if they're all pooled together. And again, it is just a fact of today's context. But I strongly support what the Biden administration is doing, for example, to engage with and collaborate with all of our allies and partners around the world as it constructs, together with those allies and partners, the most important policy in today's world, which is the creation of a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments with an S on the end approach to the relationship with China. And so again, this is something, and you know, where does the UK fit in that? Very, very prominently.
You've almost answered.
The whole idea of global Britain is based on these unique characteristics and capabilities and attributes that Britain brings, the UK brings to the world. And it's why it has been again, that's why I stopped in London to and from Baghdad, Kabul, Qatar, you name it.
You've answered the next question I was going to put to you on the ability of other allies to operate without the US. But can I take you forward slightly to the impact?
Could I note just very quickly? I mean, there are some examples. The French in Mali is an example of that, but it's a very modest, and in fact, it is supported by about 1,000 US troops quietly. And by other partners, including, again, as I recall, the UK and other European partners. But even there is a degree of strategic patience that may not be present going forward for something that would seem to be sustainable. The operation in Libya is instructive. Remember, that was remember our president actually said we were leading from behind. We were allowing the UK and France to lead that effort. But at the end of the day, my recollection is that the US flew something in the order of 65% of the sorties, did all of the combat search and rescue, had to loan bombs to both the UK and France, I think, when their supplies were getting very short at one point in time. And at the end of the day, ultimately ended up being really sort of the linchpin for that whole operation anyway.
Thanks for that, General. Can I take you forward to something that General Mark Milley told the Senate Armed Services Committee, where he said, I think that our credibility, US credibility with allies and partners around the world is being intensely reviewed. And I believe there's a comment here from yourself that was reported in the Wall Street Journal as saying, I don't think you can dispute that the outcome here is a blow in some fashion to our reputation and credibility. So we're practically at this point. Can you speak to what you think that means, what the withdrawal means, and the impact it will have on not just US and UK relations, but with other allies in NATO, and how will that affect broader US strategic interests?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I think a critically important question. Let me explain why. Because in the global context, in this most important endeavor that we are carrying out, again, US and its allies and partners for the relationship with China, we want to go to great lengths to ensure that there are no misperceptions or no mistakes, there are no stumbles into what could be actual conflict. And the way to ensure that is to ensure that you have robust deterrence. And as you know, deterrence is a function of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And of course, that latter quality rests on this somewhat intangible concept of credibility. I am one who believes that credibility is something that, again, it is not just in one situation, it does have implications elsewhere. The fact that we are perceived, whether it is actually even fair to the United States or not, because if you talk to the US national security team members, and I have, they will say, look, we consulted the daylights out of our European and NATO and other coalition partners on Afghanistan. Well, look, as I said, I was just in the Warsaw Security Forum. We had a lot of leaders from different NATO nations there. They did not feel that they were adequately consulted. Perhaps maybe it's just that after all this consultation, the US still reached a decision, a policy that was not supported or agreed with our allies and partners. In any event, there is a perception of inadequate consultation. And then unfortunately, the situation with AUKUS, which is, I think, an important initiative.
That was my next question.
But of course, and again, to be fair to our national security team, they thought that there had been adequate consultation between our great Australian partners and France, but obviously it turned out from the perspective of Paris, at the least, that was not the perception. And so you have a situation where the longest standing alliance in America's history, that which ultimately led to the French fleet blockading Cornwallis at Yorktown and enabling us to win the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which led to the Treaty of Paris, the location of that, again, significant. This longest standing relationship in our history has been somewhat bruised. Now, again, to be fair, the President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, every national security advisor have gone to incredible lengths to try to reassure our French partners and allies. They have sought to do the same with our European partners. They have all traveled out to the region. They were all over Europe. Last week, I guess it was, 2 weeks ago, Secretary of Defense is out there now.
General, I wonder if I might...
The reality is that we have to accept that, at the very least, there's a perception that our credibility is somewhat, again, at least called into question, intensely reviewed, whatever. So what do we do about that? And again, I think the administration gets what it needs to do about that. And I think they're actually intent on doing it. And I mentioned earlier, we're doing what we need to do everywhere else in the world. This was a bit of an outlier.
General, I wonder if I might pick you up on that, because you've talked understandably about the US administration post-AUKUS. But of course, our inquiry is about UK government policy on Afghanistan. But given AUKUS has happened right in the shadow of that, do you think that the UK government, and indeed the Australian, but principally the UK government, have done enough? For example, you've just talked about the Secretary of State for Defence and the Defence Secretary for your government and the Secretary of State in the US government doing as much as they can to repair the relationship. Do you think the UK is doing enough to do that, to ensure that the alliance is not as bruised as it otherwise might be?
I'm afraid I really don't have sufficient visibility of what your government may or may not be doing. It's hard enough for me to see to track my own government's actions and to some degree those of Australia, which I've been focused on a bit as well, since that's really the proximate issue here. I think the fact that the French did not withdraw their ambassador from London when it did withdraw them from Canberra and Washington perhaps has some indication and can help answer that a little bit. But I think that's one that your own government probably has to answer better than I might be able to. And I would note, again, it wasn't even just the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor, and the President. I mean, it was really everybody. This was a full court press. There was a clear recognition. Again, I have heard from the members of this particular group in closed sessions, if you will, and there is a recognition of the need to do repair, and they have set about doing that. And again, I think by and large, and virtually everywhere else around the world, in all kinds of, in a comprehensive way, that effort has been ongoing. Afghanistan is, though, a bit of an outlier in that regard. And it is one that, I think General Milley was quite forthright in saying that our credibility was being intensely reviewed. That was a rather diplomatic way for an infantryman to put it, in fact.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Royston, did you want to come in? And then Henry, if you want.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, General, for joining us today. It's a great honour to have you with us. You've talked about, I think in the media, about China and Russia and their potential involvement in Afghanistan going forward. How do you see the effects, the interests of China and Russia and Pakistan as a result of the Taliban takeover?
Well, thank you. I might start with Pakistan, because I think this is a bit counter to what has actually happened. I think actually Pakistan is going to be the country under most pressure as a result of this. Again, you will recall that there was a degree of celebration coming out of Islamabad, a degree of, I don't know if I'd even call it gratification or something, but again, they certainly were not concerned by the Taliban takeover, to put it mildly. But now, because of this humanitarian catastrophe that we are going to see in Afghanistan, the logical recipient of the refugee flow is going to be Pakistan. And they can try to close the Khyber Pass and the other borders and all the rest of that, but there's many ways to get across if you're sufficiently desperate. And tragically, Afghans are already sufficiently desperate, and they are going to get even more so as foodstuffs and humanitarian assistance and so forth come up short. There's just no way. The economy has completely collapsed. There's no money available. The reserves are frozen. IMF, World Bank, not lenders of resort at this point in time. And there's no prospect, I don't think, that China would step in and provide the 75% of the budget that the US predominantly and some other major donors, Japan and the UK among them, have provided. So I think, again, I fear actually for Pakistan. I think it is already a somewhat fragile democracy in various respects. It's well over 200 million people. It has nuclear weapons. Again, I have concerns about the implications of this for Pakistan, noting that, of course, the benefits they used to receive from all of this transit and the other activity that was devoted to supporting efforts in Afghanistan, that is also gone. And again, they were a big importer of various foodstuffs and other items into Afghanistan. With respect to China and Russia, it's interesting that I actually see a lot of converging interests, not just between China and Russia, but also with the US, the UK, and a number of other countries. None of us want to see, again, this kind of humanitarian catastrophe. We don't want to see another geopolitical Chernobyl like Syria, the meltdown of a country that spews millions of refugees all the way into Europe, causing the biggest domestic populism challenges that European democracies have faced at the very least since the end of the Cold War. I'm not saying that is necessarily going to happen. It's much tougher to get to Europe from Afghanistan, but it is not impossible. And we are already seeing some indications that there will be efforts to do just that. The China, Russia, US, UK, we don't want to see a flourishing of the illegal narcotics industry, something that the Taliban either used to control or was aligned with or what have you, certainly got some revenue from. They say they're going to shut it down. I'll believe that, of course, when I see it, because there are literally very few other crops producing any kind of items for export. Noting, by the way, there was a drought this year in Afghanistan, so they begin the winter season already with inadequate foodstuffs produced within Afghanistan, in addition to all the other problems that are coming about as a result of the Taliban takeover and the collapse of the economy. The lights could go out if they can't continue to pay for electricity from the Central Asian states and refined fuel products from Iran. Are they going to continue to receive those? I think a very good question. China and Russia and all of us are concerned about this being a hotbed of extremism. Extremists have celebrated the takeover by the Taliban. The Islamic State was augmented very substantially by hundreds of individuals broken out of the prisons that the Taliban liberated, if you will, on their way to Kabul. You've seen these attacks already, particularly against Shia mosques and Shia populations. The most recent one, of course, in Kandahar this past Friday prayers. You're seeing fighting internally. The resistance forces have by no means given up. They're actually gathering a bit of momentum. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the Taliban are becoming acquainted with how much more challenging it is to be a counterinsurgent, a counter-terrorist force than it is to be an insurgent and hang out in the hills and attack when you want to and then go back to the hills. It is much, much more difficult. They don't have the intelligence. They don't have the surveillance, the reconnaissance, and all the other assets that are necessary, as we have learned over the years, to do just that. China and Russia, I think, also want to see the Central Asian states, Russia in particular, the former Soviet republics, continue to flourish and to do well. And then lastly, I just don't see China, again, rushing right in, even given the extraordinary mineral wealth. You'll recall when I was ComISAF, we did an assessment at the time that determined that the wealth in the ground was $2 trillion. So even more than 1 trillion in the ground. The problem, of course, is that the human, physical, and other infrastructure and capital just is not there, nor is the security situation sufficient at this point in time to see some big initiatives, much less the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline for natural gas that we envisioned when, again, I was the commander in Afghanistan. In fact, China left the copper mine south of Kabul in North Logar province after being on the receiving end of some rockets and mortars, again, sadly, during the time that I was the commander. We hoped they would stay. We wanted to see Afghan mineral resources exploited and produce hard currency for the country. But again, there will be a cautious approach to this. And of course, the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all, has drawn down somewhat in recent years. But beyond that, it is not one that gives money to a country. It is one that loans money to a country to do an infrastructure project that enables China typically to extract minerals or other resources or other services from a particular country, or enable them to build their infrastructure. And again, I don't see the immediate prospect of that, given the unsettled nature of the government right now and the internal dispute, again, between the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani Taliban, with the Afghan Taliban leader in Kandahar and the Haqqani leader in Kabul.
Can I, sorry, Chairman, just quickly, you talked about celebrations in Pakistan, and of course, that they will be short-lived when they find the pressures of refugees and the rest. But can I ask you just about some of the other neighbours, if you like?
Yes.
Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. I know that Tajikistan apparently is harbouring the sort of Afghan resistance. How do you think it's going to play out for those countries?
You know, I'm actually not as certain of that as perhaps I might want to be. I mean, Turkmenistan, I think, will stand on the sidelines. That has traditionally been. They allowed us to refuel there at the most when I was U.S. Central Command commander. Uzbekistan did partner with us. They did allow, during the time that I was CENTCOM commander, we did create the Northern Distribution Network, as it was called, with the approval of then President Karimov, to restart the line of communication that went through Uzbekistan, then through Kazakhstan, then through Russia, by the way, and then out to the Baltic or some terminus in Western or Eastern Europe. Tajikistan right now, you're right. And by the way, Uzbekistan also has a number of refugees and individuals who feared for their safety. It's not clear over time what Tajikistan will ultimately do. Russia still has very considerable influence there. I think they're sorting out how they want to approach this. Kyrgyzstan, a little bit more remote. We had a transit center there, a base at Manas, as you may recall, for a period of time. But again, I think they will probably not play a huge role. And then Kazakhstan is, of course, not contiguous to Afghanistan. So again, it is not clear to me yet, nor, frankly, is it clear that various countries around the world have yet made decisions about whether or not they want to support an opposition to the Taliban, as an example, which may have some slight attraction if you're not particularly fond of the Taliban, as I think is prudent to be, but also recognizing the hardship that that could create for Afghan citizens at the same time. So I think these are very, very tough questions that by no means have countries in the region, much less countries around the world that have in the past resourced, say, the Mujahideen against the Soviets and this kind of thing. I think these are very open questions right now, and ones that are being reviewed pretty carefully in various capitals that matter around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Henry, very briefly, we're going to have to let the General go in about 3 minutes. So very last one, if I may.
General, it's a great privilege to have us with us today in the Foreign Affairs Committee. In discussions and conversations that we have had with the Pakistani government, clearly, as you correctly say, they were ambivalent or at best pleased at the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. They are encouraging much closer diplomatic relations of Western nations like the US, UK, and others with the new reality in Kabul. What's your view on that, please?
Well, again, I have to answer as the professor of economics that I was once or twice during my life that, it depends. And in this case, it depends on the nature of Taliban governance, it seems to me. There were hopes, they may now be seen as misplaced, perhaps, that this was going to be a kindler, gentler Taliban. At least their spokesman initially, seemed to present this, it would be a much happier place, if you will, for women, for girls, for minorities, all the rest of this than it was during the Taliban regime of the late 1990s, when they, of course, did harbor al-Qaeda and refused to eliminate them from their soil when the 9/11 attacks were planned there. And, you know, when they ruled as if it was a 7th century kind of interpretation of an ultra-conservative, beyond that even, interpretation of Islam. So far, what we are seeing, it is a bit of a mix because, of course, there are local leaders that are interpreting things in local ways. But by and large, I don't think you can look at what has happened and say that it's particularly encouraging about the ability of women to continue to go to college or to continue to go to even secondary school or to have a job other than in a place which is strictly female, like an attendant at a female latrine or a toilet or something like this. Again, very, very restrictive so far. And you know, by the way, I say this as someone who, my wife and I actually have sponsored a scholarship for a woman at the American University of Afghanistan. That woman is now in Qatar, by the way, studying because the prospects were so impossible in Afghanistan. So I think as we are seeing what is becoming the reality of Afghan governance under the Taliban, again, there will not be enthusiasm for endorsing what they are representing in the form of recognition or even in the form of direct assistance to the government. Rather, there will be what is going on already, which is how do you bypass this government and put aid into the hands of international organizations that can be trusted to get the humanitarian supplies, assistance, and so forth, services directly to the Afghan people, as difficult as that is in a country that is controlled by the Taliban in every respect and has checkpoints everywhere that will probably have a tariff and so forth. So I think that's the reality on the ground. I think it's understandable that Pakistan's prime minister and other leaders and foreign minister would say that we want you all to embrace, or at least to recognize, or at least to work with, to support the Taliban, because they are now staring the reality in the face of a humanitarian collapse and of the prospects of millions of Afghan refugees flooding into their country once again. And again, a country which has its own extremism problems and has many, many other problems and challenges, all of which will be exacerbated by this influx of huge numbers of humanity who need basic services and support. So I think very, very understandable if you're sitting where those in Islamabad sit, but not as understandable if you're sitting elsewhere in the world.
Thank you.
General Petraeus, thank you very much indeed for joining the committee this afternoon. I'm enormously grateful for your patience at the beginning as we were voting, and I'm enormously pleased to see you again. I hope very much we'll meet up soon.
The pleasure was mine, Mr. Chairman. Noting again how privileged I was to have you in our command.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for what you did then, and thanks to you and to all of you for what you're doing now. And thanks for the great partnership that is that between the US and the UK, and especially when it comes to those who are men and women in uniform and men and women in the intelligence services.
Thank you very much, sir. With that, we'll break just for a very brief moment as we bring on our next two witnesses. I won't close the session. Michael, do you want to just step forward? And then, sorry, Ms. Miller, hello.
Hello, I'm here.
Good. We're sort of carrying on live rather than breaking and resetting, as I know that you're in place. Excellent. As before, I'm just going to ask you very, very briefly to introduce yourselves. Michael, do you want to go first because you're in the room?
Okay. I'm Michael Semple, professor at the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice in Queen's University, Belfast. I'm delighted to have that position. But I've had many years of experience working on Afghanistan and have seen through more than one big change like we've witnessed over the past 2 months. I started working there with Oxfam, went on to work with the United Nations, so I was a political I was a humanitarian coordinator during the first Taliban rule, and then a political officer who helped to roll out the bond settlement and lay the foundations of the Afghan state, which has just collapsed. And then I worked as the deputy to this special representative for the EU.
Thank you very much. Ms. Miller, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Laurel Miller. I'm the director of the Asia program at the International Crisis Group, which is a conflict prevention, conflict resolution focused non-governmental organization. As for Afghanistan experience, I was the US deputy and then acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan from mid-2013 to mid-2017, and have also before and after that engaged in my own research and analysis regarding Afghanistan when I was at the RAND Corporation and in other capacities. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Michael, if I can go to you first, please. Mark Endwell, who, as you know, was the Cabinet Secretary here in the UK, has said that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was an act of strategic self-harm. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. At least in the way it was conducted, I don't think it was necessary to maintain a military presence there forever. But I certainly do not think that the withdrawal was not a response to military defeat. Insofar as there was a defeat, it was a defeat which was brought about by the way in which the withdrawal was conducted.
We're going to come on to a few more areas of this, but do you agree with General Petraeus' argument that maintaining a small, capable force of enablers was achievable in the longer term?
I think it's absolutely clear, and I think that a lot of people will be struggling as to why that option wasn't exercised. Right. I suspect that there were also options that enablers would have been over time rendered redundant. So you would have had still a full military withdrawal, but not in May or September of 2021. I think the key issue as to why this didn't happen all revolves around what was happening politically in terms of the relations with the Afghan government and the broader Afghan state, and what was happening politically in the attempt at a peace process with the Taliban. So I've no doubt that it would have been possible to maintain enablers there. I suspect that it would have been possible to stable the security situation as long as they were there. But the question is, what would have been achieved during that period? I think that significant course correction would have been required for it to be worthwhile staying there. But I suspect that I would say I was asked to give some response to to President Biden's last sort of big speech on Afghanistan when he explained his decision making, and he explained that he was faced with a binary choice between two bad options of a get out and accept that you've no longer control over what happens, or extend the military presence and provoke an escalation from the Taliban and be left with no viable endpoint. I think that there were alternatives which would have led to a reduction in the conflict, primarily through political action. But I suspect if the president felt that he was choosing between those two bad options, it's because he was not convinced by or was not offered in a sufficiently persuasive way. The third option, which was you continue to do something with the military, but for a finite time with a good prospect of success.
Thank you very much. Ms. Miller, may I ask you, what influence do you think the UK or indeed other allies had on this decision?
Minimal influence. I mean, I think this was clearly a decision that was made in Washington. That doesn't mean that there wasn't discussion and consultation with Britain and other allies, but I don't see any evidence that the views of other allies were factored into the decision to withdraw or the timing for withdrawal. That said, frankly, I also haven't seen clarity of objections. I mean, if the view, I haven't seen allies and partners clamoring for staying in Afghanistan. Some voices have, some individuals have, but as a matter of government policy, it's not at all evident to me that allies and partners weren't ultimately satisfied to see the US take the decision that it did, even if there was hand-wringing about the manner of the withdrawal.
Thank you. Alicia, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. Thank you both coming for us. Michael, to you first. In terms of, what's your assessment in terms of the speed of the takeover by the Taliban across Afghanistan? And how do you feel the international community should be engaging with or responding to the anti-Taliban opposition that exists?
When you ask me how I assess the speed of the Taliban takeover, yeah.
I'm sorry, in terms of the public assertions that the international community couldn't have expected it to be so quick, and the intelligence community didn't either.
Well, I think that we've got to sort of look back through at least the past 3 years, and there are different ways in which either there were failures of intelligence or failures to use the available intelligence during that period. From September, October 2018 up until February 2020, of course, there were the first set of negotiations between the US team and the Taliban, trying to get the US-Taliban deal. I think everybody struggled to make sense of what the Taliban strategic intentions were. There was a sort of like a chance to look at that again after the deal was done at the end of February 2020. And thereafter, it became absolutely critical. And I would take it, say, go from March 2020 up until May of this year. And I think the question that you should be asking of, whether it be myself or people who are there making decisions, is how did you understand the Taliban's strategic decision, the strategic intent, and how did you respond to any such assessment? Because what the US was trying to do, as far as I can understand, and obviously Laurel Miller knows a huge amount about this, was the US was trying to create conditions in which they could actually pull their troops out and leave some kind of viable political setup, because they had brought the Taliban on board and offer there's a key logic to it, basically saying to the Taliban, rather than trying to grab everything for yourselves, far better for you to cut a deal with the other political forces in Afghanistan. You will then win the blessing of the countries of the region and the world, and even with US troops out, or possible if you together asked for some kind of residual assistance, that also be possible, and that might be on the table, but there will be a continuation of economic assistance, and this is actually better than military victory. And the attempt was to get them to buy into to this logic. And so if I'm talking about sort of issues around that, intelligence and the Taliban takeover, it's how much, what did we understand about their intent there, and whether they were taking the bait or not. My assessment during that period was that, I like the logic, but my findings from researching the Taliban suggested that the leadership of the Taliban had not bought into that logic and had prioritized taking power by force, and that their main backers in Pakistan were not putting enough pressure on them to make them to actually take the bait. Although obviously there was a huge amount of cooperation between the US and Pakistan into rolling out that negotiating process. So that's the key issue as you get round until sort of like May of this year, which is when I would, because you had like an ongoing military campaign by the Taliban, and I had multiple interactions with senior US officers in the field, US officials during that period, who were hoping they could somehow reduce violence, persuade the Taliban to reduce their violence, and we tell them, look, it's not happening. But then when you get to the final stage from May of this year, the Taliban launched their final offensive. And that's that's an outcome of the strategic intent which they anyway had. And by that stage, what you have to be looking at is assessing the strategic decision making by the Afghan government, their response by attempts from their partners, particularly the US, to actually say, hey, switch course, because of I'm sure that people like General Miller have been trying to tell them that you've got to redeploy, you're not going to have our resources, we're getting out, you can't hold on to the country, but if you can hold on to the key strategic areas. So I think the intelligence questions there are not so much what the Taliban is doing, but they're around what the Afghan government is doing, how they're redeploying their forces, and in a sense that the speed of collapse has got as much to do with the failures of the Afghan government and its security forces to respond to that final offensive, and the inability or the reluctance of the US to do what was necessary to basically get their partner to change course, and hence we get the collapse. So when I try to again make sense of where this intelligence failure and linked policy failure, it was when the Taliban didn't do what all of us in one way or another involved wanted them to. They didn't do that. That we failed to invest in an adequate parallel alternative strategy, a plan B. And then when it sort of comes pretty much clear that, look, you really are in this final offensive, and there were critical errors being made in Kabul, and nobody was sufficiently focused on that to be able to change them.
Thank you very much. Laurel, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, and particularly I'd be interested to know whether the opposition, the anti-Taliban opposition, whether you're seeing them pop up, whether they're trying to talk to organisations like the International Crisis Group, what your assessment is of essentially their current situation.
I'd like to comment on the question of intelligence failure, but first on this specific question of anti-Taliban opposition, remnants of the former regime. We're not seeing that as a significant factor at the moment. This is not the Northern Alliance of the 1990s with the kind of external support within the region that it enjoyed at that time. I think we're seeing in the region and more broadly much more of an inclination to find ways to work with rather than against the Taliban rulers of Afghanistan now, at least for the time being, and that is different than what we saw in the past, even though there haven't been countries rushing to recognize the Taliban formally, because no one wants to jump first. They want to jump as part of a group. I think we see an inclination in that direction, and as soon as there's an opportune moment, I think we will see a number of recognitions of formal recognition of the Taliban regime and a lot of de facto recognition and working with them until that time. But it has to be said, I mean, we haven't seen the end of history in Afghanistan. And so I am certainly reluctant to predict the indefinite durability of a Taliban government that is facing a lot of internal and external challenges of different kinds than they have faced before. And so past performance is not entirely a guarantee of future performance by this government. They're going to experience new challenges. some of which General Petraeus alluded to, of being now a counterinsurgent rather than an insurgent group, and a government rather than an insurgent group. But also they have their own flanks to worry about in terms of other militant groups. On the question of intelligence failure, my view is there was not an intelligence failure, because what happened was not a surprise. I mean, as any policymakers know, and as I'm sure the committee members are well aware, intelligence assessments are probabilistic assessments. They are not predictions of the future. And even if intelligence agencies and analysts got it somewhat wrong on what the specific timing was for how quickly the Afghan government would collapse, the trajectory of collapse was predicted. I mean, no one was saying, and none of the public reports of what the intelligence have said have indicated that intelligence analysts said this government is sure to hang on and just provide it some money and it will. It was a question of when, not if. And I can't imagine, I mean, having those assessments, but I can't imagine that they weren't caveated in some way to indicate the probabilities. My own view, and I said this many times before it all happened, was that there was a genuine probability of rapid downward spiral, of rapid collapse of the Afghan government that has much to do with the Afghan government and a lot of individual decisions within the Afghan security forces that could not be assessed and calculated as it did with anything that the Taliban was doing. It was two sides of a coin. I thought, as many did, that it was somewhat more likely that the Afghan government would be engaged in a pitched battle for urban areas with the Taliban over an extended period of time and wouldn't collapse so rapidly. But I also thought, and I don't think I was alone in this, that the percentage chances that that was the dominant, that may have been the dominant scenario, but the percentage chance that that's what materialized as opposed to a rapid collapse, I don't think you could really assign numbers to that with any high degree of confidence. Moreover, you know, policymakers don't just make it's not a straight line decision from intelligence community tells us X and therefore, you know, we do Y. There are lots of inputs, including what diplomats say in their reporting, what external analysts say, and what policymakers themselves observe. And intelligence assessments are only one input to decision making. So my personal view is that overemphasizing what was or wasn't said in some particular assessments of how rapid the collapse could be were incorrect. I mean, when I was in government, even as early as, I would say, in the 2014-2015 timeframe, when the US was anticipating that it would be withdrawing from Afghanistan by 2016, and we were doing contingency planning for possible evacuations, rapid downward spiral and need for rapid evacuation of large numbers of people was absolutely a scenario that we anticipated as a possible scenario. And because it was our view at that time that a decision to withdraw forces and the beginning of withdrawal would provoke a crisis of confidence within the Afghan security forces and the Afghan government and among the Afghan population. And that was at a time when the Afghan government was stronger and the Taliban was weaker than what the situation was in 2021. So again, you know, couldn't predict it with precision, but at the same time, not surprising.
Thank you. And thank you both. And I apologise that I have to leave in a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Chris, do you want to come in? Just briefly, the bit that confuses me about what you've just said is I've heard of intelligence which said very clearly, round about the beginning of the year, that although the Afghan government maintained that it had 50,000 special forces based in Kabul, only 500 would ever be prepared to fight. I don't understand why, on the back of that, everybody wasn't able to predict fairly clearly, and some people clearly did predict fairly clearly, that Kabul wasn't going to last very long.
Well, that's a question I directed to me. I think yes. I mean, the will to fight issue. First of all, I want to be clear that questions about, you can raise questions and examine questions of will to fight without it being about blaming individuals within the Afghan security forces. This isn't about their patriotism or their bravery, and at least not in any kind of systematic way. The unpredictability of will to fight is part of what I would point to when I say that there was a huge amount of uncertainty as to how long the Afghan government would hold on and whether you would see a rapid collapse. Because I never believed in the years that I've been involved in this, even when there were many more US and NATO forces in Afghanistan in contact with Afghan forces. I did not believe it was possible for foreign forces to have their finger on the pulse of the will to fight among the Afghan security forces rank and file, and what kind of factors would lead to decisions to melt away, as has happened in other Afghan conflicts at other points in time, as happened in 2001 with the Taliban.
But if you don't mind me saying, that's a bit of a flaw when it comes to an exit strategy, isn't it?
Well, or it's just a reality of the limitations of your ability to know what is really happening inside the Afghan systems and institutions that you as a foreigner are just going to have limited visibility into. It's just it has to be a question mark on your ability to be confident in your assessments of what was going to happen. I mean, I recall sitting in meetings in the US government when the question would be posed to US military officers, how cohesive are the Afghan security forces? And this is, some years ago. And they would say, very cohesive, wait, no problem there. And I would think to myself, how do you know? Like, how can you know? And that's not to criticize these people, but to me, that was an unknowable, and you had to consider that as a variable with high degree of uncertainty, a lot of individual calculations. But the final point I would make on this is, I don't think it would be correct to say that that members of the Afghan security forces failed the system or failed the country. I think it was a system that failed those individuals. And the system wasn't there that once you pulled out the American factor, the NATO factor, that had both a psychological impact, a psychological glue, as well as a practical material support for the security forces, they lost confidence in the ability of their leaders, their system, to support their mission and to lead their mission. And so that's why I say I think it was a system that failed the forces rather than forces that failed the system.
Michael, can I ask you a slightly different question, which is just, as I understand it, the Afghan economy is somewhere between 72% and 82% constituted of aid. There's a real danger that aid isn't going to get through, and we might want to use aid as leverage for all sorts of different reasons, because we want to ensure freedom of movement and women and girls are treated properly and human rights issues and so on. It feels as if the prospect for Afghanistan is really very bleak, and that civil war is a not inconceivable possibility in the next 6 months.
And I think this relates also to the bit of Alicia's previous question that I didn't get to answer on the resistance or what happens next. So, putting these together, yes, Afghanistan does face an unprecedented economic crisis. In terms of what kind of drop in GDP you're talking about, something like halving of GDP, over a period of 1 or 2 quarters, way beyond anything that any country in modern times has had to cope with. Because it's not just a question of aid which was provided government to government or through the agencies. What we've lost is the most of the infrastructure of the modern economy that had been put in place has just...
The middle class to deliver it.
Absolutely. So like 1 million people thrown out of work because government stops. But also in my UN role back in the first period of Taliban rule, one of the things I did was actually I was tasked to assess the humanitarian impact of sanctions then in place, which one version of which now continues. And one of the things I looked at as sort of the fact that in that period, before sanctions were imposed, the banking system was already non-functional. So the Afghan economy, insofar as it functioned, was already operating unbanked. Over the past 20 years, we've helped Afghans develop a banking system. And so everybody who's involved in international trade in Afghanistan, and of course it's a trading country, they're now all banked in a way that they weren't 20 years ago. And then suddenly all the banks have closed. We've got like one bank is just managing to move a wee bit of money, but basically in effect, all the others have stopped trading. And so it's not just that governments aren't providing assistance. It's if you go to like the main trading cities up in sort of in Mazar, the ones around the other port cities like Akina and Kandahar and so on, that most of the business has just simply stopped. So that the way that the Taliban therefore that impacts the Taliban on their attempts to run the government, of course, is that they've come to power, and that the people who now moved into the ministries really say, we've fought this 20-year jihad, we've defeated a great superpower. Now I'm in the minister's seat and I've got no money. I've got no food to give to my followers, and I've got no money. And literally, I mean, people go around and visit Taliban ministers and they say, can you lend me a $5 while you're here? I mean, it's that kind of level. Or I've just captured 100 pickup trucks, but I don't have any fuel to put them in. That they talk to Taliban officials who are struggling with responsibility for whole regions of the country, and they feel under siege by widows or women who tend to do this with the submission of the applications for assistance. Say, what can we do with them? I mean, part of the model I think that Taliban are pushing. They've got like sort of two versions of their model. One simply in some of the places where some of my researchers have listened to Taliban officials. They've basically said, "Don't worry, we don't." Or they said to the population, "You have to feed our troops now, even if you've got almost nothing yourselves. But you have to give money to our troops. Don't worry, it won't last for long. We'll get international recognition. Then the world will fund us. We'll be able to feed our troops off the back of that, and we'll leave you alone thereafter." So for the Taliban, recognition is the route for them to be able to hold their military together, consolidate in power, build their Islamic emirate on international dollars. The alternative version is, at least if they can get the humanitarian aid funding, the limited customs revenue which Afghanistan, even under the Taliban, can generate, was sufficient to run the Taliban military, to leave next to nothing over for civilian administration, but the military that you need to keep the population down, and the internationals will provide the humanitarian assistance for at least some feeding the population. This is the kind of struggle that they're facing. However, I would absolutely agree with what Laurel said earlier on, that we really don't know the outcome of this process. And although the Taliban clearly fully intend to consolidate their Islamic Emirates' grip over the country, whether they can pull it off, we don't know. You mentioned civil war. My reading of it is there is already a civil war underway, and the question is, what's the route to ending that civil war? And on the issue of resistance, that there already is resistance to Taliban rule. One should remember that this is not just it's not just a replacement of one group by another. This is a violent takeover by a group which has got an extremely limited ethnic base of support, which has never demonstrated any significant support amongst the population. It's their military effectiveness which has allowed them to get into power. They have already in the first 2 months governed in such a way that they're succeeding in alienating not just much of the population, but even many of their own people who are questioning what it was all about. There's deep concern inside the Taliban movement since the power grabs by the Haqqani group and people who are closer to the ISI than the core Taliban from Kandahar. They're deeply worried by that. The latest version of the Northern Alliance, you could just label it National Democratic Forces. I mean, National Democratic Forces, people who've got do have a power base, particularly in the non-Pashtun ethnic groups, and then some of the Pashtun strongly opposed to the Taliban. I mean, they are reorganizing. They're prioritizing political action before they scale up the military action. They say they want to try and get back to a broad-based government. They don't think it's likely the Taliban are going to buy that, but they feel obliged to prioritize political action before they go back to the battlefield. The timing for and this people look around and say, oh, there isn't resistance to the Taliban. If there is military action, it comes further down the road. They're building, they're rebuilding, they're rearming. Unfortunately, that's a reality. It's not decisions made in this room or any Western capital. It's something which, in a sense, the Taliban have triggered, because that was also the logic they were told. Don't do this. Don't do the power grab. Resistance will be inevitable. One of the differences, perhaps, between the prospects this time is the Taliban may not have changed over the past 20 years, but the Afghan population has. So that there is a significant prospect for civic resistance against the Taliban. What are the Taliban going to do when hundreds of thousands of people say, you people precipitated this economic crisis by defying the wills of your population and the advice of all your own international partners, let alone rivals, stand aside. What are they going to do? They can't shoot everybody. Nobody knows what's going to happen into resistance. We know there is resistance happening. I think it has implications for this issue about how do you engage. The Taliban are not the only actor in Afghanistan. We don't know what it's going to look like in 6 months' time. Anybody who is trying to engage with the Taliban should also be engaging with the other forces in Afghan society. You need to spread your bets.
Can I go straight on to that, to Royston? I know you wanted to ask about British engagement with the Taliban.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was going to ask about how we should consider the Taliban a unified group, but I think you've answered that they're not. And in that context, then, how should we deal with them? What does the international community, what leverage does the international community have?
I mean, just a few thoughts on this. First of all, the Taliban are in power. Afghanistan still counts. It is important to deal with Afghanistan. One part of that has got to be dealing with the Taliban. So yes, you have to engage with the Taliban. I think if you accept my assessment that this is not an equilibrium state, that the Taliban hanging on to Afghanistan, with having defied all calls for some kind of inclusive administration, it's just not going to work. And there is a real risk that international engagement with the Taliban actually prolongs the agony by helping them to hang on longer. So I think a recommitment to a peace process in Afghanistan, which reach that stated objective, of a broad-based Afghan government with an inclusive political system, with the Taliban on the inside rather than the outside, broadly acceptable to the population and able to conduct its dealings with the international community. That's the sustainable end state in Afghanistan. I think a political recommitment to that is something which should go alongside the acceptance that you have to engage with the Taliban now. That leaves you space to engage with other political actors, and it goes some way to mitigating the risk that by sitting with the Taliban, it looks like that the world has decided that the Taliban are here to stay, because Afghanistan is a country which has got now centuries of sort of like global engagement, whereby decisions by political actors inside Afghanistan are influenced by what they see the international and regional actors doing. So you have to be very careful not to be giving the wrong message. Frankly, it's not in the interests of the West to see a consolidation of the Taliban if there is an alternative of a more broad-based system. So that the key thing in UK engagement should be do it in such a way that increases the prospect of a viable peace in Afghanistan rather than just prolonging the agony, prolonging the civil war by propping up the Taliban somewhat.
And Ms. Miller, do you have anything to add to that, please?
Yes, I mean, I would say unfortunately, as a representative of a conflict prevention organization, I'm sorry to say this, but I see essentially no real means for external actors such as the UK, the US, and other allies to try to promote broad-based inclusive governance in Afghanistan right now and any kind of broad-based peace process. The Taliban simply aren't interested in that. Everything they have done so far demonstrates that they are not at this time interested in that. The countries that have somewhat more leverage over them, the countries such as Pakistan, Qatar, China, I think are disinclined to, although they would like to see a more broad-based inclusive government because they know, as Michael indicated, that the current more monopolistic form of rule is not stable in Afghanistan. They are not prepared to use any kind of really forceful leverage over the Taliban in order to achieve that. They're not prepared to withhold from the Taliban this kind of de facto recognition that they are enjoying now. The aid that that Europe, the US, and others, the traditional donors, could provide is marginal leverage over the Taliban at best. They are not showing that they are susceptible to that form of leverage. I think humanitarian assistance is not being used and should not be used as leverage. It should be provided on a completely non-political basis. And I think that at the end of the day, the Taliban, because what they are prioritizing is holding on to power and satisfying constituency number one, which is the fighters who brought them to power and on whom they depend for continuing in power. They, I think, are prepared to tough it out, to facilitate the acceptance of humanitarian assistance, and then to be prepared to rule a steadily more impoverished Afghanistan and to adapt to that impoverishment. And although Afghanistan has changed in the last 20 years, I think it would be a mistake to see those changes as permanent and somehow a buffer against regression.
How do we get humanitarian aid to where it needs to go then, without the Taliban preventing that or taking that or siphoning it off somehow?
I mean, there's always some siphoning that happens in some fashion, or at least in the sense of taking credit for the delivery of aid that is actually provided by foreign donors and international organizations. But there are international organizations, UN agencies, international NGOs who are still on the ground in Afghanistan, who've worked there for many years, including during the former Taliban rule in the 1990s, and who have the systems in place to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance. So I don't see any great obstacles for what is purely humanitarian assistance to be delivered. I do find it surprising that the UN's appeal for humanitarian aid for just the remainder of this year, as of last Friday when I checked, was still less than 50% filled by donors, even though that is the one area where donors can, without too much concern about facilitating Taliban rule, provide support to the Afghan people. So there's more that donors can do on that front, even while other forms of aid are problematic. But of course, humanitarian assistance is only a mitigating measure. It's a bandage kind of measure. It's not going to reverse the trend of greater impoverishment of Afghanistan and the economic problems that Afghanistan is facing, which have both political and practical dimensions. And I think for Western donors, the political obstacles to providing the kinds of assistance that were provided to the last government, which it has to be said, didn't prevent the kind of fragility that we're now seeing materialized. I think the political obstacles there are, you don't need me to tell you, are extremely significant, in addition to the practical ones of trying to work with a not fully formed, not fully competent Taliban regime.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Bob.
Can I ask a question of Laura and then a couple of questions for Michael here? Laura, can I just, and apologies, I've come in late, so apologies if you already answered this. You were talking about the collapse, the moral and the various reasons for the collapse of the Afghan forces. What extent was the withdrawal of Western technical ability part of that? And the reason I ask that specifically is because of the nature of the way that the US used overseas contractors. So if you had a helicopter or a helicopter capability, the Afghans weren't necessarily part of that because the helicopter came with a contractor, and as soon as the money dried up for that, whether the helicopter stayed or not, the contractor wouldn't service it, therefore you couldn't use that kit. So to what extent did our sort of lack of trust of our Afghan partners mean that when we pulled out, the expertise needed, especially with drones and air power, went with it?
That was for me? Or?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I mean, that was certainly a factor, both in real practical ways, but also in affecting the confidence of the Afghan forces that they would be able to hold on. Of course, this was a very long-term problem and well recognized by the US and I think NATO as well, that there was a dependency for the more high-end capabilities like the Afghan Air Force. There was a dependency on foreign contractors. It wasn't that people in the US Department of Defense and elsewhere didn't recognize it and weren't working to try to address it. The undesirability and the unsustainability of this arrangement was known. The problem was just it takes a long time to build up the indigenous capabilities to provide that kind of maintenance support. And there was a lot of frustration with this. And there was also a lot of frustration with the fact that these high-end forces were being, over a long period of time, particularly the Air Force, used in ways that really just ground them down and created and redoubled the maintenance challenges that there were. I think you could say, and again, I don't put this on the Biden administration per se, because I think it would have taken much longer than the period of time they were in office to deal with this. But I think you have to say there wasn't really a plan for withdrawal. I mean, there was a political imperative for withdrawal that we've seen building up for years in Washington. It was not new with the Biden administration. There was resistance to the idea of complete withdrawal from within the Defense Department. There was a plan for pulling out the people, but there wasn't really a plan, and I'm not sure there could have been really there wouldn't have been a perfect one in any event, but there wasn't really a plan for the aftermath of withdrawal, including on this issue of contractors. For a variety of reasons, one of which is I think there was concern that if you plan too concertedly for it, you actually make it happen and you precipitate some of the dynamics that you're trying to avoid by trying to avoid the withdrawal. So the short answer is this was one of the precipitating factors in the context of withdrawal, one of the precipitating factors for collapse, but it wasn't the uniquely responsible factor.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Michael, do you have anything to add to that? Because if you don't particularly, I'll come on to another couple of questions. Okay. You talk about the sort of cleft stick that we've got, that if we recognise the Taliban, you could potentially get more aid into the country. So you could argue there's a significant moral imperative when it comes to helping. But at the same time, you say all we're actually going to be doing is prolonging the agony, and therefore we shouldn't necessarily be recognising the Taliban. So with both, ethical concerns at fore, but also look to our national self-interest, what is the best approach? Is it not to recognise the Taliban, to force them down to a more moderate route, if such a word is applicable to them, or to, or what would you do in these circumstances? What would you be advising government to do?
And of course, we know that there are issues around what is recognition anyway. But I think that we're talking about the extent to which there's diplomatic engagement and the extent to which there might be a move towards the withdrawal of sanctions and the restoration of economic assistance. I do not see how it could be in the UK's national interests to be involved in consolidating a regime which, in a sense, grabbed power directly against the advice and strong warnings of both the regional powers and US allies, and which has adopted a deliberately provocative approach in its formation of the administration. Because this is not just about a question of did they agree to the broad-based formula and agreeing to some kind of power sharing. They chose to insert some of the most controversial figures available to them at the top of the administration.
You're talking specifically about that?
I'm talking specifically Siraj Haqqani brought in as Interior Minister, somebody who's directly responsible for the operation of suicide bomb networks, attacks on UK, attacks on US, attacks on Afghan civilians in large scale, and personally ordering and celebrating them. Somebody who I wrote a little piece a while back about something we got. He addressed their military commission with some great sort of like dream of the prophet and the angel Gabriel predicting that he would be the instrument through which God destroyed America. I mean, this idea, and they did not need to appoint him Interior Minister. I mean, there's a tradition in Afghan. There's always a good way of you can retain your influence by putting a proxy up forward. They deliberately chose the most provocative appointments. That you go to people like Tajmir, who was until like 14th of August. He was directly a suicide bomber trainer. These are the people who have refined the use of suicide bombing and exported the technology around the world. He's now inserted at deputy level at the National Intelligence Service. I cannot just the messaging that would give. That they would suddenly they're sort of like respectabilized and normalized without any evidence that they've also since given up on their ambitions to use these tactics. It's inconceivable.
Just on the Bobber point of view, is this what sort of levels of are we talking about complex operations for the far enemy in terms of suicide bombing, or are we just talking about strapping lots of dynamite to sort of vulnerable people and shoving them into a marketplace to create fear? What sort of levels of sophistication are we talking about with that?
World leading. These are the people who invented world-leading, complex attacks. That they and I mean I think one could give we can look at it at two different levels. One is this level. There is the practical and the direct. Do you have valid concerns about the imminent prospect of them now using their new control over the intelligence apparatus to launch these attacks outside of Afghanistan? I mean, that's one issue, and that's of course a very specialist area. But even before you conclude that, say, Tajmir is about to open up a new camp somewhere outside Kabul and start developing complex attacks in the region or in Europe, before you even think about that, I mean, it's the messaging. So do you really think? I think actually that the political cost even at home would have to be so high to be seen to be consolidating and financing such people, rewarding them for refusing all options to compromise. You're rewarding terrorism.
A very narrow base. Now, the Taliban has always been half, well, correct me if I'm wrong, half sort of religious extremist, but half Pashtun movement of various different types. Maybe you'll argue with that. To what extent is it still entirely reliant on its Pashtun base? Because you said it was alienating other groups. To what extent does it have any support amongst Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, and others?
It's obviously very, very important question. In terms of power inside the Taliban movement, both the stuff which is quite visible because it's now announced in senior appointments, but also what we understand when we sort of try to determine what's happening inside the Taliban military. Power inside the movement is exclusively Pashtun. There are some non-Pashtun appointments in their overall lists, but they're all deliberately non-power positions. But I think we should be careful about how we see that they don't. They're not. The Taliban movement is not a credible representative of the whole Pashtun ethnicity, but they do make they are from the Pashtuns and they make use of some of their tribal connectivity. They have systematically excluded the Uzbeks and Tajiks from power. When you get into power, you have to find some way of dealing with the local population. So they can try and pursue some kind of co-option. But for now, the story is that this administration is exclusively Pashtun. The non-Pashtun minorities are excluded.
But I don't understand then why they were able to defeat the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, because these people have a warrior culture themselves, and were well represented in the Afghan armed forces, and perhaps overrepresented in the Afghan armed forces.
We spent 20 years trying to build up and fund and empower a centralized system. The sole strategic partner that the West recognized in Afghanistan always resided in the presidential palace. Initially for perhaps some good reasons, but we remember the story of the disarming of the warlords, that in a sense the strategy that US UK ended up supporting was one which spiked the guns of the most obvious resistance to the Taliban, and
why was that?
That's the reason why.
Why?
Well, because that although part of the selling point of the Islamic Republic was that it did practice a form of pluralism, and at least all ethnicities in Afghanistan had a place and a stake inside the Republic. But when it came to the management of the security forces, that was centralized in the presidential palace, and that the West bought into a strategy that should be Pashtun-led, and that while part of the price of building up the centralized security forces was weakening the traditional faction leaders who had an ethnic base. And over for example, the last 2 years, I think if you look at some of the decisions that were taken in the security sector, they were more about weakening non-Pashtuns inside the Afghan security forces than they were actually about defeating the Taliban. Now that's just something which is, I would just say, I think the verdict on this, on how important this and how real this was, will probably come later, because it's got to be unpicked more. But certainly this is something which they fed back to us. So there was a basis for resistance, and certainly no acceptance. In fact, up until the 14th, 15th of August, there was a broad national consensus in Afghanistan that they did not want the Taliban back in power, but there was a complete failure to translate that sort of ethereal political consensus into effective resistance.
Yeah, forgive me, we're going to have to move on because we've got two further witnesses, and I just want to ask some very brief questions, if I may. The first is this a direct threat to the UK and to the West? Michael?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Afghanistan is and will continue to be. I mean, if you were doing a detailed list, you go through. There are some sort of like direct and tangible effects. There's some indirect effects to the UK and very intangible. And just run through. I mean, it's something which people will be commenting over the years. I would actually start off with the largest proliferation event on small arms since the end of the Cold War, the potential refugee crisis, the possibility of that we know that the international militants are ensconced in Afghanistan. They were waiting for this day. What will they do? But also that I personally think that the reputational effect that General Petraeus referred to, I think it is very important and will be long lasting. I know many hundreds of Afghans who are asking, why did I cooperate with these people in all the things that we're doing? Whereas now ultimately I'm left to try and survive under the very people we're operating against.
May I just ask, Ms. Miller, the relationship with countries like China, Russia and Pakistan, do you think that we'll be able to work with them to secure some form of influence over Afghanistan, or do you think our role is now entirely nugatory?
I think it's worth trying to work with them, or at least communicate with them and try to be on the same page diplomatically in terms of what kinds of messages are delivered to the Taliban. The more there is unity within the international community, particularly including those countries you've mentioned, and the Western governments as to the messages that are delivered to the Taliban, the more prospect there is of, at least at the margins, shaping their behavior. Those are the, China, Russia, Pakistan. These are the countries that are going to have the most direct influence over shaping the Taliban in the future, even though their leverage is somewhat limited as well. Also self-limited by the fact that they want to see this Taliban government succeed. So I would certainly advocate trying to engage with them to the extent possible, even recognizing how difficult it is to be on the same page with that set of countries.
May I, for a very final question, if I may, I'm going to try and keep you brief, Michael, forgive me for doing so. I've met in recent weeks with members of and directors of UN agency who've been asking about giving money through the Afghan governmental system. My own view has been to say no, there is no point in seeking to sustain or enable a terrorist network that now holds a government. Would you work through the Afghan political system as so much as it still exists, or would you be looking simply to fund emergency aid through UN agencies and similar directly?
I think that you should be working through UN agencies and the NGOs and liaising with the Taliban authorities. And for anything more profound than that, I think you have to wait until there is a viable alternative, and that viable alternative will be if the Taliban, if say in a year's time the Taliban are still in power and maybe they've consolidated, hey, maybe you can work with them. But things are going to change. That do not bank on what you see today in Afghanistan being there, and you shouldn't get on the wrong side of history in helping it to stagger on. But for the moment, working with the UN agencies and the NGOs in liaison with the Taliban authorities is a viable option.
Do you think that
May I offer one exception to that? I mean, I largely agree with that recommendation, but I would say in healthcare, it is essential that the healthcare system not collapse in Afghanistan, and ensuring that may require more engagement with the Taliban health ministry than would be required in other areas.
Wholly agree.
Okay. Would it be true to say that the countries that supported the Taliban were surprised by their catastrophic success? Michael?
Given that they didn't seem to have a plan in place, I would think that that's the answer. I mean, the Taliban are surprised by it, and you just cannot underestimate the extent, you cannot overestimate the extent to which Taliban, now in power, are saying, what on earth were we doing?
I'm going to thank you both very much enormously, and I know we could speak for much longer, Michael. You and I normally do. So I will thank you at that point, and I'll invite our two next witnesses up, if I may. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'm going to ask you very, very briefly to introduce yourselves, and simply because you're in the room, Shukriya, would you mind going first?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and honourable members of the committee, for the opportunity you provide. My name is Shukriya Barkzai. In the last 19 years, I've been several times in this house, holding meetings, exhibition, and speeches. But this time I'm not representing any country or any group of people. I was a member of the Constitution Drafting Committee in Afghanistan, a journalist, women's rights activist, member of parliament, and my recent job was ambassador of Afghanistan to Kingdom of Norway.
Thank you very much. And Shahrzad, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Of course. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Shahrzad Akbar, and I'm chairperson for Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, currently speaking to you from Turkey.
Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us, and thank you very much for your courage over many, many years of standing up for rights in Afghanistan. May I ask, Shukriya, when did you first realize you had to leave Afghanistan?
The threat of Taliban, death threat. I was not planning to leave my country. I was waiting for the peace deal to happen between government of Afghanistan and the Taliban, because in the last 4 years, the people of Afghanistan was aiming to be witness of peace from the long war. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. And when I felt direct threat from the Taliban at the airport, and after that, it made me to take decision to leave my country.
Could you just tell us how that process of departure worked? Where did you get help? What happened?
I was normally scheduling my trip to Turkey, to India at the beginning. But unfortunately, due to the long queue and busy traffic on the 15th of August in Afghanistan, in Kabul, I couldn't manage. I missed the flight, and I rearranged at the airport to get to Turkey. But unfortunately, that was the plane which couldn't take off due to the runway was been packed, or uncertain people was get into the airplane. And after that, we realized that the government of Afghanistan was been collapsed. It was very strange. I get into the airport where all the border police, everything was been informed, standing, checking, looking the passports, but later on, suddenly, like by finger snap, things changed. And all night, I was been in the plane because I realized that there's no hope for me to go out. And unfortunately, I noticed inside of the plane, the midnight, when the Taliban came and they was looking and searching for the people. And later on, the chaos and massive people on the ground. And after that, while I was been realizing they're after me, when I get to the terminal, just to go somewhere, but it didn't happen. I joined the crowd on the ground, but again, they were after me. They beat us in front of US soldiers. They was ready to shoot. There was a bullet exchanged between US troops and Taliban, but just on air. And that was the time that I decided they're after me. But unfortunately, before all these things happened, that's why I couldn't make to go out. When first they entered to the city, they loot my house. One of my colleagues, she sent me a photo why Taliban was entering to this street where I lived, as the famous TV. Tola was been there. So I realized they're after me. And after that, when I left the airport in a bad situation, condition, I was been struggling. I was calling officially and asking the British government to help me. That was early morning, 16 August 2021. And finally, with the help, direct help and communication with you, Mr. Chair, and Honorable Dabi Ibrahim, and with the cooperation of Lord Tariq Ahmed, finally, after 7 days and 6 hours, I got the letter that I'm eligible. And I was being evacuated by the cooperation between US forces, Royal Air Force, United Kingdom, and their forces.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have helped. Shahrazad.
Thank you. I left Kabul on the morning of August 15th on a commercial flight to fly Dubai with my husband and my son. We booked the flight on Thursday, which I think was like 12th of August. At that time, I booked my ticket with a return on 22nd of August because it still hadn't sank in that things would fall apart so quickly. But by the time I got to Dubai, and then on my next flight, we had learned that President had left the country and Taliban had fully taken over. And I knew that at least in the short term, I wouldn't be able to go back.
Chris, do you want to?
Thanks for your witness. It's very moving. I know there are quite a lot of people who are still stuck in Afghanistan who would like to be able to get out. The Taliban are now issuing passports, as I understand, but you have to get a visa in a passport and you have to go and get a passport from the Taliban. Is there a way around this circle? Can you see, do you see any prospect for other people coming out? Yes, you can.
Yeah. I do believe it's very dangerous for any, especially women or people with well-known Taliban or looking after them, to get a passport. Because Taliban knew that people are leaving the country. And from my understanding, always in an emergency situation, there are some exceptions. So I do believe if the case of Afghans, especially those are in immediate need, and those are their life in danger. So if we ignore the old bureaucracy, which is suddenly it will may bring more obstacles and will kill more time and will give more people to the hands of Taliban. So if we save the lives of people, that will be the chance to give them priority first, and second, safe passage without lots of bureaucracy in between and confusion. We cannot, Afghanistan not in a normal situation. When a sentence I say I'm not presenting a country, I think that means a lot to me. I'm someone from the country that the state was not being recognized, the people were living in different parts of the world, even including the country. There's nobody's taking responsibility, so this is the emergency situation. I hope it should be understanding widely.
I'm presuming, but maybe I'm wrong, that you came through Doha?
I came from Kabul to Dubai, and then from Dubai to Oxford.
Shahrazad.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's a very important question. Yes, many people who are at high risk are still in Afghanistan, and we have reports, verified reports of former members of security forces being targeted and killed, as well as defenders being harassed and targeted in media. So it's a very severe situation for large groups of people. Now, in terms of what can be done, it really depends on the political will of the countries. There are ways, I can give examples of my own colleagues. 3 of my colleagues and their families were accepted by New Zealand. One family, all members had passports. 2 other families, some members had passports and some didn't. But they somehow managed to negotiate, New Zealand, managed to negotiate with Pakistan and got our colleagues out to Pakistan, and from there they were processed and they will be sent, we're hoping they will soon arrive in New Zealand. So there are ways that negotiations can be done. There are also, I know, cases of other countries, at least one case where there was an agreement reached with the Pakistanis, and the families showed up at the border of Pakistan and just showed the letter that they had received and some more documents that they had received. Not all of them had passports, but they were admitted to Pakistan and then from there processed. I know there hasn't been a question asked on this, but I want to raise it. With UK, our experience with the Commission, we have 392 staff, and we consider a majority of them, if not all of them, high risk because of their human rights work. UK initially gave permission for us for 6 of our female staff who were high risk and had very public profiles. But by the time we got the response from the UK, 4 of those women, we had already evacuated them to other countries. So they took in, UK took in 2 of our colleagues. And then we sent them an updated list of 6 colleagues, and we didn't hear back despite repeated follow-up. So at least in my field and with my colleagues, there are smaller countries in Europe that have done better.
Yes, I've heard that as well. And I've heard that we're being a bit slow. Even once people have got out of Afghanistan sometimes, then the next bit of processing is very slow. As I understand it, the Home Office has still said that they've not added a single member of staff in Pakistan or in any of the neighbouring countries to be able to process people more quickly. Just a question though. I understand why the US and the UK and other countries might not. The amount of leverage we have with the Taliban might be very low, but other countries might. Do you think other countries might credibly argue to the Taliban that if they want to stop the brain drain, which is undoubtedly a problem for the future economy of Afghanistan, the best way to do that is to allow freedom of movement? Because if you know that you're going to be able to get back out once you've gone in, you might go back in. Is that fair, Shakriya?
Of course, is that fair? But is there any guarantee that terrorist group of Taliban will hold themselves accountable and they will fulfill the promise that they made? I think from my experience, when they were not loyal to their United States of America Doha Agreement, how they can be considering that point as an important point.
Okay. And Shahzad?
I don't know to what extent other countries in the region are talking about the free movement issues with the Taliban or other human rights issues. I do think, of course, definitely it's something that's worth pursuing. We have a relationship, for instance, with Qatar National Human Rights Committee, which is like a sister organization. It's a national human rights institution. And we have been talking to them for a long time about our own colleagues and them talking to their Ministry of Foreign Affairs to talk to Taliban about our colleagues and people like our colleagues being able to get out safely and kind of continuously reminding them that all Afghans would like to go in their country eventually, and that this is not helping with Taliban's national image, it's not creating trust in the population. But I'm not aware to what extent the regional countries do actually raise these issues to them, with them, to what extent this is part of the conversation with them. In fact, I don't know to what extent these issues are part of the conversation that, for instance, UN even has with Taliban. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, Chair, if I could come in on, and Shakriya, you just mentioned that obviously the Taliban had been trying to find you, trying to locate you, so it's understandable that you do not trust the Taliban. What's your take on their actions so far in charge, and what do you think it tells us about how they are likely to rule Afghanistan? Do you believe they're different? I think it was the former Foreign Secretary here who described them as Taliban 2.0, which I think is pretty crass, but do you think they've changed at all in the 20 years that they haven't been in government?
I was running underground school during the Taliban, 23 years back from now. Their mindset, their behavior, their belief is exactly the same. In fact, this time I believe Taliban are just only changed by one thing, because before, Taliban was a kind of unified group. But right now, they were been dividing themselves in a different 2 groups. One which is close to Qatar, more Kandaharis largely, that they are delivering political messages. Another one which is more close to Pakistan, and especially to ISI of Pakistan. They belongs to largely Haqqani network. But unfortunately, which is they are controlling militarily So that's why you can see the different messages with different actions. So that difference also comes from the division among the Taliban. But unfortunately, Taliban are playing politically certain roles. From one side, they are controlling the country. From the other side, they are not taking responsibility for target killings, for the security, for the genocide, and including for the rights and the constitution that already they adopt.
Do you think it's fair to suggest it would be naive to take the Taliban at their word that they've changed?
I think, from my understanding, so I will use the hat of being a journalist, and I just want to be frank and honest with you. Taliban never was changed. Their messages exactly was the same. It just, a different picture of Taliban was being showed just for the Doha Agreement, and that's it, just for the withdrawal, just for the peace deal between United States and Taliban, just to bring in Chinese in the region and somehow see the consequence of that.
And do you think, and feel free to come in, Charles, said, sorry, it's harder to engage through Zoom, but just do speak if you wish to. Do you think that the Taliban will be able to contain all of the other fractious elements and other terrorist organisations, ISIS-K or whatever you want to, Daesh? Do you think that it's possible to keep a lid on those tensions, or do you think that will unravel as we go forward?
Well, some of those are been a great allies of Taliban while they jointly fighting against the government of Afghanistan and foreign troops. But right now it seems to me that ISK will be a headache for the Taliban and of course for Afghanistan and including for the region. So they will be more important the way they are operating against Shias and the way they are irritating other countries in the region, so they may be more important than Taliban very soon. But why Taliban are not taking some of the reform action, it's because they don't want to lose their foot soldiers to the ISK. Because ISKs are more wealthier than Taliban at the moment.
Yes.
I'll just quickly comment on.
Forgive me.
No worries. And the earlier question in terms of Taliban's change, I absolutely agree with Ms. Farkzai that we don't see change in terms of their actions. I do feel like they have a more sophisticated communication strategy. But beyond that, if people listen to Afghans, especially to Afghan women from the beginning of the peace process, there was a consistent call for the fact that Taliban should be held to their actions, not to their words. We in the Commission had reports of stonings of women in Taliban-controlled areas, lack of women's access to education in Taliban-controlled areas, lack of civil society and independent media in Taliban-controlled areas. So we didn't need new evidence. We knew how they were ruling. They were ruling parts of Afghanistan at the time. However, diplomats prefer to listen to what was being said in Doha, not the evidence, not give equal value to the evidence that was coming from the ground. And now we see that, in fact, they are so unwilling to change that something that's as universally accepted in Afghanistan and all Muslim countries as women's access to education is something that they are depriving girls.
And just one final question before I know Bob's ways to come in, sorry. You mentioned Doha, Shakriya. Who should the UK be engaging with in order to exert influence over the Taliban and try and extract those thousands who were left behind, for example? And I probably, I'm aware that the chair of standards there. I should probably say I've just come back from Qatar, so on a Qatar.
And I was there and all.
So I think I have to get that on the record.
Which was paid for by the Qatari government.
Is it the Qataris? Is it Pakistan? Who do you think we should be engaging with to try and exert influence and to try and help, like in my case, constituents, families who are still in Afghanistan?
I do believe Qataris. Qatar is much, they're feeling themselves more accountable and they have good leverage on Taliban, and we can use the Qatar. Because Pakistan, right now among the group of Taliban, one group of Taliban in Pakistan, also there's a kind of verbally issues, which is it may increase more. So I believe using Qatar, not only for the evacuation, but I will put a humble request on the committee if there is any possibility for a conference to be held and engage women of Afghanistan with a direct talk to the Taliban. Inside of Afghanistan, it's impossible to bring women and ask them to talk and speak freely with the Taliban. So outside of Afghanistan, it will be possible. I do believe Taliban is right now, it's an elephant in the room. We cannot deny them. Of course, I'm not supporting recognition of Taliban, but some sort of engagement is necessary. It's just to make Taliban to be accountable, to hold them accountable for their actions.
Thank you. And Shah said before.
Thank you. In terms of leverage on Taliban, I do think, yes, Qatar, Pakistan definitely. I mean, what we hear, and you know, this may or may not be entirely accurate, is that the Qatar group is very much marginalized, even with the appointments that happens. But I do agree with Ms. Parkside that Qatar remains an important player regardless. But Qataris also do not seem extremely happy with all the decisions being taken by Taliban right now. So I think it's important to engage Qataris, Pakistanis, and China as key actors. And this conference that's going to happen in Moscow, you know, kind of, I'm trying to figure out more about it, but what role will Russia have, and to what extent Russia could be brought on to have some unity of messaging to Taliban, as former witnesses also emphasized.
Thank you. Excuse me, Bob.
May I ask you both, to what extent does one see women's issues and women's relationship with the government as a specific issue, or to what extent do we see it as being bound up in more general questions about human rights?
I think human rights and women's are very vital and very important issues. Okay. For the time, half population of Afghanistan are being just banded from a normal or from very fundamental rights and duties. The large number of unemployment after the government of Taliban, when the Taliban take over the power, it increased. So that means poverty among women also been increased. It's been doubled and tripled than before. When it comes to the simple rights, when we are talking about human rights, freedom of expression, education, access to the healthcare, they are the fundamental rights which is today's Taliban are not delivering. Beside of that, they're banning girls from going to school. I think it's very crucial. If this time we let like 90s Taliban to do whatever they want to do, that would be another chaos. And I would also kindly asking everyone humbly, also do not ignore the resistance of those civilian resistance in Afghanistan, that people are standing for values such as women. Every single day there are demonstrations. Women are going on the street. They're asking about their rights. And if internationally we don't have any support, locally it will be very impossible for Taliban to listen to our messages.
Okay. But if I'm a man in Kabul, I am. In what way could the Taliban be oppressing my rights? I mean, clearly, if I was to take up arms against the Taliban, I'd be an enemy. In what way are they oppressing me as a male Afghan, as opposed to women?
Yeah, Shahzad will may answer.
Do you want to answer that question?
If I may, yes, of course, and Ms. Barkzai can also, of course, step in. Just in terms of human rights situation overall and women's rights, so Afghanistan has made some progress, very flawed, on human rights. We have never been signatory to so many conventions as we have been in the past 20 years, including, for instance, Convention Against Torture, Child Rights Convention, CEDAW, a whole bunch of international commitments. We then worked very hard, the human rights community in Afghanistan worked very hard to align our own legal framework with these conventions. So for instance, our penal code is much more humane than what we had before. We have an anti-torture law. Well, we have, I don't know what's the status of our legal framework right now, but we have an anti-torture law, an anti-torture commission, we have a child rights commission, and a child act that was in line with international standards. So what we see in the behavior of Taliban, the inhuman punishments, you know, the way they punish quote unquote thieves, lack of due process, the suppressions on freedom of expression. In these areas, we see it impacts everyone, men and women. So if you're an Afghan man who is allegedly a thief, they will hang you or cut your hand or do something extremely cruel and inhuman to you. And the situation for detainees, for instance, men and women, everyone is impacted. But of course, women are particularly impacted by the harsh rules of Taliban. And the difference is there were many men in the Afghan government. I worked with the Afghan government both as an activist and also an insider. There were many men in senior positions who did not believe in gender equality, right? This is not a secret. But I had the legal framework, and women like me had the legal framework to protect us. So if a man tried to, even if he was a senior official, tried to silence me because he didn't believe that a woman is equal to a man, I could use this legal framework to protect myself. If a woman was being abused in her home, there was a legal framework, not only legal framework, but institutions that she could go to. There was Attorney General's office, there was a deputy on elimination of violence against women focused on that. There were units at the provincial level for women victims of domestic abuse to go to. There were shelters, safe houses. None of that exists right now. So that legal framework doesn't exist, but also Taliban as a group, it's part of their identity. They believe women are not as human as men. They believe this. They genuinely believe this. They genuinely believe women are not equal to men. Women are less human and they should have less rights. And now they are in power. So the implications for women are, of course, far greater.
And Shahrazad, the second question then is, are there any elements of the Taliban which are less bad for you than others, or do you see them as a homogenous group?
I mean, no group is really homogenous, but I think the way the whole peace process worked really sidelined those voices who could be somewhat reasonable for their own self-interest. I'm sure there are people among Taliban who recognize that it's in their own self-interest to bring their people and their fighters along to the idea of a more moderate version of governance to continue to receive international aid and recognition. There are people within them that are pragmatic enough to recognize the fact that doing something like they did today, they did in Kabul, the Minister of Interior had a meeting with families of suicide bombers and rewarded them with plots of land. There are people among them who know that this is not okay, this doesn't help with their international recognition. However, those people have very little voice right now because they're being told, we defeated the US, we defeated the government, we defeated the international community. Why do we have to compromise? Why do we have to try to bring our fighters, the most extreme among us, along? We don't have to do that. We'll just starve our population and then people will recognize us and will take it from there. I genuinely believe that people like that among Taliban are now very lonely and marginalized because of the way things unfolded.
Thank you. And Shukra, to what extent did the Taliban in the last couple of years use the more liberal framework in Afghanistan in order to say, look at all these dreadful politically correct people with women's rights? Did they use it as a recruiting tool to drive maybe the more misogynistic, the more conservative men into an armed camp that overthrew the Afghan state? So to what extent did they use women's rights as a motivating factor in war, do you think?
Am I allowed to say how Taliban in rural areas, they gained the trust of people? It started from the civilian casualties, early 2002 till 2021. So they was been targeting those people that they lost their members of family, either by war, by airstrike, or by any names, which is not thousands, probably more than 1,000 families. And sometimes even the villages were being targeted. So those kind of misunderstanding and misactions was been giving extreme opportunity, golden opportunity for the Taliban to go and target people. And to be honest, from my understanding, the ideology of Taliban are very, really interesting for the people in the villages, which is they never seen the government deliver any service to them in the last 20 years. They never been witness of having school or clinic or road or electricity or a media. So in the last 20 years, they had just preaching from Taliban. It's understandable that they will have more sympathy with the Taliban than anyone else. And beside of that, Taliban is an ideology. They are a militant group, which is they are working systematically. They are not just a mushroom that comes after rain. No, their ideology, their policies, their framework, somehow it's working among the people which is they are uneducated, among the people which is they don't trust government, and among those people which is extremely they don't have knowledge of what Islam is exactly about. So I'm very surprised how the OIC keeps silence against the action of Taliban, while they are saying women being educated, this is an Islamic issue, or then they are referring to culture of Afghans. So I'm surprised how Islamic countries are not contributing as the way they should, or take its stage action to bring Taliban at least for an open Islamic debate. So from my understanding, in any country, if anything happened, there is a chance for the enemy to use people against the government for their own interest. And beside of that, when the group of Taliban right now, while they're celebrating their victory, they had a military rally, and on that rally, proudly they put 5,000 of their suiciders, including the big yellow boxes that they were carrying all those suicide equipment, and they feel still that group are existing. That's a big threat, not for Afghanistan, for region and for the world and for the globe.
A link very much to that. Are you surprised at the Taliban apparent willingness to work with China, given its policies towards Muslims in Xinjiang? Sorry, were you going to come in?
No, really. For Chinese women's rights, human rights, terrorists, nothing is working. I will not be surprised to see Chinese invasion in a different way, an economic way in Afghanistan. Chinese may not send their soldiers, although a small number of Chinese soldiers were before in Afghanistan, but the Chinese invasion is not far away from Afghanistan. I can see it right now.
And I had a wider question, Chair, if I may. Do you have any sense of the number of people still in Afghanistan, including those abandoned by the UK, who will be seeking to leave the country? And do you think the UK's 20,000 Afghan citizen resettlement scheme is a sufficient figure for the UK to be taking after 20 years of involvement in Afghanistan?
I do believe that's not a sufficient number, first. And second, even those close partner to UK, those whom they work with, the UK militaries, they are in Afghanistan. And allow me to ask and seek help for those vulnerable groups, such as females judge, such as journalists, such as women's rights activists, such as member of parliament, such as member of civil society organization, people they are working with the Afghan security force. So they are in a high risk, and Taliban are after them. I would like if the number get doubled by this year. That would be a great opportunity. Saving lives of your lives, I think it may work in the longer term or future.
And Charles, do you have a view on those?
Sure. I also think that ACRS numbers need to increase and need to be more realistic, considering the number of people who are being left behind. I mean, just in terms of human rights defenders, media, activists, and their families. Obviously, you can't just take someone out and leave their family behind at harm's risk. We still have larger numbers of people who are left behind, and I do think that the scheme should also kick in soon. I understand that it hasn't officially began. Targeted killings are happening. We have reports of it in the commission. We had a report. My colleagues looked into to the extent that they could document, because they are also in hiding. Most of my colleagues are in hiding. But to the extent that they could document, and probably cases are much more than that, over 100 people were killed in targeted killings, detained illegally and then killed by Taliban, people affiliated with Taliban, and 40 days of Taliban rule. And I'm saying this is not the full number. So people are at risk right now. And I think Taliban, I mean, some places where they have been able to, I don't know, control their fighters or local dynamics. Some places it might be less intense, in some places more intense targeted killings of especially former ANDSF, but also judges and prosecutors. Absolutely agree with Ms. Barakzai. Judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, these are vulnerable groups, particularly women. They just might be waiting for the right opportunity, and they might just be hoping that as the attention shifts away from Afghanistan, then they will go after these people. And even getting to Pakistan is complicated for people right now. I have colleagues who have gotten to Pakistan. Some of them don't have legal paperwork to be there, so they live in fear and anxiety about the Pakistani police and the situation there. And some who have gotten there and have legal paperwork, they have no means of supporting themselves and no certainty about what the next few months might look like. So yes, the short answer is the numbers need to be increased, the scheme needs to begin, and people who have already arrived in the UK, they need to have clarity. I spoke to people who are in bridging houses, and it's not being managed well. It's very inconsistent. The level of support is very inconsistent. Access to health care services. There's not a lot of clarity and information about what's next. I understand that the UK government is overwhelmed, and I understand, you know, someone earlier was saying that extra staff need to be hired, but these things need to happen fast.
And in order to try and extract some of those people that you've mentioned who are still at risk, having worked with the UK and because of working with the UK and other countries, should the UK be sending any aid through Taliban-controlled organisations, even as an interim measure to try and extract people, or should it all be channeled through international and non-government organisations, for example?
Right.
Yes, please do.
I would also like the UK engagement to see through to the international organization and international organization through to the local channels and local channel with the Taliban. So that will make the Taliban to be more working close with non-governmental organization. That will be from one side the opportunity. On the other side, it may give a little bit of freedom for the people that, for instance, they work with the UK, they cannot say that direct to the Taliban, but it's easy for them to communicate with the non-governmental organization and through to the international organization. I will definitely like the idea if any kind of engagement through to the international organization with the local organization, with the cooperation of Taliban.
Thank you. Shahzad.
Thank you. I think the work should be done through international organizations and Afghan civil society who are still on the ground, and we even have Afghan women-led organizations that are still on the ground. And I think there are a few things. I mean, humanitarian assistance should be unconditional, absolutely, and not political, but women should be front and center, as UN keeps promising us, but then we keep seeing them in the UK sending male-only delegations to meet with Taliban, which doesn't really send the right message. But women should be front and center in the sense that women should be consulted, and we should make sure that the assistance arrives to women. I do not think that assistance should go through Taliban-controlled organizations or through Taliban unless there are some really concrete steps being taken by Taliban. I mean, of course, there are things around sanctions, but and people being on sanctions lists, running ministries and whatnot. But for me, one of the key issues would be we can't recognize and support you or your governments or organizations affiliated with you unless you recognize half of your population, the women.
Thank you very much. Now, we've agreed to stop at 5:30 for you, Shahzad, I know, so I'm going to come to a last question with Chris.
Very quick point, really, is I don't quite understand why the Taliban have got such a problem with women. Because it doesn't seem to me that it stems from Islam at all. It's a kind of cultural conservatism from a particular sort of part of Afghanistan. Is that fair? There's nothing in the Quran that says that you can't educate girls beyond a certain age, and I don't understand how they think they're going to be able to run most of the departments of government without women. Or am I talking nonsense?
No, you're absolutely right. Because in Quran, this is the order for men and women to read and to be educated. That is the order of Holy Quran. And allow me to say, Taliban are women are not the only, maybe physical group the Taliban have problem with them. They have problem with the history subject in the Afghan curriculum. They have problem with the music. They got a problem with the sports. It's not only one area. They got a problem with being accountable. Their power, they have a problem with the election. They have a problem with source of legitimacy. It's not only one type. It's just a militant group, and I hope the expectation from a militant group should be limitized just for the nature of the military groups are, and especially when they are a terrorist group. It's hard for them to digest women. It's hard for them to see a prosper, developed country. It's extremely unbelievable for them that how joyful is music and sports for everyone. They never.
I went to Erasure on Sunday night. I'm sure they'd love Erasure.
I think on that note, we will draw the session to a close. I think there's no way we can top your Erasure, is there? Shahrazad, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Turkey. I'm extremely grateful for you being here. And Shukriya, may I say, it is a huge privilege to have you here, and I'm very grateful that I was able to play a small part in ensuring that you are here. Congratulations.
Yeah, you save my life, save a mother for her kids, a daughter for her mother. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having
On that note, may I say, order, order.
Sound. Committee Room 15, sound. Committee Room 15, sound. Committee Room